if the Christian mission is disciples make disciples, then when you make a disciple, you've made someone who wants to go make another. That is sort of Flywheel-esque. Like it's going to compound on itself. But I do think that, without thinking about it that way, we can end up fragmenting our energy into a lot of different directions that maybe don't interrelate and they don't create momentum in and of themselves. That's the great thing about a flywheel, like you're saying from Collins. I mean, the flywheel, the big heavy disc of a flywheel, it uses the momentum from the first turn to go into the second turn. And you have to exert less effort on the second turn to get it to move, And that's what we're trying to figure out is like, how do you end up seeing something that that compounds the momentum, and then one day it's spinning almost just on its own.
Right.
This is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go.
Hey everybody, welcome to Breaking Barriers podcast. My name is Pastor Bobby and I'm here with Pastor Andrew. And today we're going to talk about how to build a flywheel at your church, or, I've even had a lot of people recently come up and they actually just own a business or something. They've been listening to this. So how to build a flywheel. It's something that we have really used for the last 5 years. We've actually talked about this a little bit when it comes to our personal lives, how to build a flywheel around personal health. But today we're going to talk about how to build a flywheel for your church. And I'll just kind of intro the background for us, how we started using this concept the way that we have. So it's not a new concept. So Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, that book now is maybe 20 years old. He talks about in that book, one of the things that really marks a great organization is they learn how to the momentum that they see in their business or organization, that they learn how to really utilize that and for it to build on itself. And so he has this concept of a flywheel. And the way that we have started using it, so I think we've both understood that general concept about like, man, you gotta put energy into something over a long period of time, and that energy will build over time, and that's how movements grow and accelerate and have more momentum over time. So for us, about 5 years ago, right when COVID was happening, our church was going through stuff that anybody else listening to this, their church was also going through. For some period of time, our staff was not in the office, and so it's like we're having to communicate through Zoom and do meetings through Zoom, and it just felt more difficult to cast vision, more difficult to get everybody on the same page. It just felt like, man, we're just moving backwards in terms of momentum. And at the same time, I was reading a book. It's like there's two books and they're like 20 hours long, and it's like this it's very fascinating, detailed look at Amazon's history from like 1995 all the way till like 2019. And it's pretty crazy because, what started as like an online bookstore is now one of the biggest companies in the whole world, and most people use Amazon. And so, but in that book, they talk about very early on when Jim Collins was about to publish Good to Great. And Amazon had him come in and do some leadership, like offsite 3-day leadership coaching. And he was very new in this concept of flywheel, and he presented it to them. And at that time, this was maybe like 1998 or 1999, Amazon then picked up on that, and they basically created their model around the concept of a flywheel. And when I heard that, it just felt like what we were going through as a church, like, man, we already had a mission, we already had what we're trying to do, but we need more clarity around what exactly are we trying to invest in terms of creating further momentum in the church. And that's kind of where this came from. We talk about our flywheel, gather, groups, give, go. We'll go deeper into that, but I want to spend more time just kind of in the intro talking about like what a flywheel actually is. So I don't know if you want to just...
Well, I think that the Christian church, generally speaking, there is an inherent flywheel to it.
Right.
But what we're trying to say is, but you can be served in a lot better way if you bring what is sort of implicit and you make it explicit, right? Like if the Christian mission is disciples make disciples, then when you make a disciple, you've made someone who wants to go make another. That is sort of flywheel-esque. Like it's going to compound on itself. But I do think that without thinking about it that way, we can end up fragmenting our energy into a lot of different directions that maybe don't interrelate and they don't create momentum in and of themselves. That's the great thing about a flywheel, like you're saying from from Collins. I mean, the flywheel, the big heavy disc of a flywheel, it uses the momentum from the first turn to go into the second turn. And you have to exert less effort on the second turn to get it to move, you know? And that's what we're trying to figure out is like, how do you end up seeing something that you know, that compounds the momentum, and then one day it's spinning almost just on its own.
Right. Yeah. I think here's what a lot of churches do. So like I over the last 3 years, I've built out like a home gym, and 2 purchases I've recently made is like an indoor rowing machine and an indoor ski erg. So one of them, the rowing, you're pulling towards you, and the ski erg, you're pulling these straps down like you're cross country skiing. And both of them are built around a flywheel. So they have like a metal disc, and like for the rower, when you pull it, that flywheel begins to turn, and you can actually hear it. You can actually hear it turning. And the thing with the rower, those first pulls are the hardest pulls because the flywheel is stopped, you know? Mm-hmm. But the thing is, if your stroke rate's not fast enough, you can pull it, and if you wait 2 or 3 seconds, the flywheel will completely stop. And then you have to pull it again and start from zero momentum. But once you start pulling and it starts going, if you want to increase the speed of the flywheel, you don't have to exert as much force to get it to speed up a little bit. Mm-hmm. I feel like a lot of churches, though, you know, the win is like reaching somebody and that person becoming a disciple. And every church, you know, if they're preaching the gospel and they're trying to be on mission, they have these wins of like somebody comes to Christ, but then before the next person comes to Christ, it's like that flywheel slows back down and there's no momentum for the next win that they have to accomplish. And so what we're talking about with the flywheel is like, how do you take that isolated event? Man, somebody becomes a believer. They want to follow Jesus. They're committed to following Jesus. How do you take that maybe happens on a Sunday or at Easter or whatever, and how do you turn that into this kind of unstoppable momentum over time? Because the idea would be, you know, let's say a big weekend like Easter, the idea would be, man, you have Easter, you encourage people to invite, and people come and people are reached, they're baptized. The idea would be next Sunday or the next big event, the fall or Christmas, those people that you reach, they're now on the team. Mm-hmm. And next time up, when you as the lead pastor or whoever says, man, invite or do this, they're now wanting to invite their friends. And so before you had X amount of people inviting, now you have more people inviting. That's just kind of the basic concept of it. And so it's kind of just going under the hood and saying, what is providing momentum for our church, and how do we make sure we're investing in the right things and we're not missing something? Yeah,
and it's in what I think what we've said is that the same thing that grows that believer is what grows the church. Because what is the church? The church is just a collection of believers. So, you know, when we talk about church growth flywheel, it's the same as personal growth flywheel. It is our discipleship process, and it's also our church growth process. And for us, it's exactly what you're saying. What are, you know, some churches might be 3, 4, 5 steps. Like, what are the 4 or 5 most essential things to put energy into that move people around around to be able to become one who then their life is now contributing to the momentum of the flywheel, where they're inviting other people in, you know, where they're sharing the gospel or they're sharing their testimony with others.
Yeah, and a lot of it, maybe you can speak to this, a lot of it does go back to like philosophy, what you believe about the church's mission and what you believe about discipleship, because I think we've seen this with a lot of churches. You know, churches kind of break up into these camps, you know, where they're like, man, we're a very evangelistic church, and because that's their focus, that's their culture, they probably, you know, do a pretty good job of reaching people. You have other churches that say, yeah, we know that's important, but man, we're not about more people in the seats. We're about discipleship, and we're about going deeper with people. And so what can happen is both those things are important, but if you don't know how they relate and you don't emphasize both of them, you can kind of end up stopping the flywheel before it even starts, because you have sort of like a philosophical issue with how the momentum works.
Yeah, if filling the seats doesn't lead to spiritual depth, or spiritual depth doesn't lead to filling the seats, you know, then you're just like, it's kind of like what we were talking about before we got on the podcast. You can end up exerting the same amount of energy as another church, but because it's not, you know, the energies are not interrelated, they're not laid out in a paradigm that ends up producing a spinning of that wheel, they can end up just sort of being diffused, you know, where you've spent a bunch of energy here You spend a bunch of energy here. But in your analogy, the rower, it was energy and then it was like a stop. And there was energy and then it was like a stop, you know, rather than it was energy that was compounding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's the reason, you know, why there's these statistics that exist. You know, if your church doesn't break X amount in attendance by a certain period of time, it's going to be more of an uphill battle. And it really is getting at momentum, you know, because you need more people to serve and to buy in and to give and to do all those things that the Bible's calling them to do. And if you don't hit some of that critical mass, it's really hard week after week to get the flywheel to spin.
Yeah, I mean, one of the books that we read early on was Ben Armet had a book called Church in the Making. It was a really fascinating book about planting churches in your hometown, and it had a lot of interesting thoughts about leveraging relationships that you've had in different ministries to help plant a church. I thought it was all very interesting. But the thing that I think you and I took out of that book that we used to say a lot of times is, you know, momentum is just king. I mean, you've heard if you have momentum, cancel your vacation. You know, it's like that, you need it so bad. But the thing that came out of that book was when momentum starts to go backwards, it grows spikes. Mm-hmm. You know, so if you need momentum, we want to catch the momentum. We want to organize things in a way that one thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another, leads back to the beginning. And then it makes it easier to push a second time. Part of that is because if you ever lose momentum, which I think a lot of us did during COVID, and it was, you know, it was just hard to get that engine cranked back up again. When it starts going backwards, it grows spikes, and it can hurt you almost worse than it can help you.
Yeah. So let's talk about 3 kind of really key concepts when it comes to, okay, you know, you have your mission, you know, and that's not the same thing as a flywheel. You have your mission now, like what's next? What are you trying to do? A lot of churches I feel like are, you know, you think about just some basic company, you know, like I feel like there's always controversy around like the mail service in the US, right? Like UPS or USPS. People get frustrated. My tax dollars, you know, and USPS and all this stuff. A lot of churches are like, okay, man, you know, reliably deliver the mail. And that's kind of the mission. Well, they just kind of stop there. You know, they just tell their staff, man, all right, reliably deliver the mail. All right, go work hard.
Yeah.
You know, well, a mail company that's going to be more successful, they're a little deeper how they think about it. They're like, okay, when we reliably deliver the mail, our customers are going to begin to trust us more. And as they trust us more, you know, they're going to tell their friends, they're going to want to use us compared to this company over here, and we're going to grow. And now what we need to do is we need to take that growth, that's more money, more customers, we need to reinvest that in reliably.
Yeah, becoming more reliable.
Reliably delivering the mail.
That's the whole key.
And it's just you know, but a lot of churches are just like, man, we reliably deliver the mail, go.
But that is the proprietary thing about Flywheel from Collins. Like you mentioned earlier, you know, I think people took from that idea, well, I just need to not overestimate what I can do in 3 years, you know, and don't underestimate what I can do in 30. Like that's what they took from it. Just keep pushing. It's kind of what they took from it, which is a good application. I mean, there's part of that that's good. We're going to talk about that.
That's better than nothing.
Yeah, you don't change your strategy every day, right? But I think the part that we've tried to talk about, and we talked about this in a previous podcast just with our lives, is how do you get that final turn to go back into the first turn, which is what you just said. Like whatever, I think you're just making that up. But if you got more customers and you got more money, how do you make that become more? Now I'm putting that back into reliability because that's where it all starts.
Right.
Rather than letting it diffuse into, we're going to just take this money and start a real estate company.
Start something else.
Yeah, we're going to do something different. We're going to, whatever. It's like, how do you make it get back in? And that's the whole thing, I think, about a flywheel that is proprietary.
Yep. So the first point is like you have to identify the right things. Not everything is going to create momentum in the church in the same way that other things are. And so you have to figure out like, okay, what are the things that we do that drive the mission forward? You know, and you could go to the Bible and you probably could name like 100 things, and it doesn't mean you don't do all of them, but you have to try to simplify, hey, what is the thing that drives this thing forward? So for us, and I'll just go through it simply, and then maybe you could, if you want to kind of stop and pause on any of them. You know, we said, okay, looking at Acts 2, where you see the momentum, right? You just read through it, and it's like, man, Peter's preaching, there's not a church, there's not believers, people are getting reached. Now those people are gathering with one another and God's adding to their number. And you could just kind of see, man, Acts 2 starts with 0, it ends with whatever, 3,000, 5,000. And it's like, okay, we could see the momentum there. So we just went and said, okay, what do we see going on there? And for us, we've not always equally done these things well. And by identifying this, it's helped us, I think, to say, okay, man, we need to invest more here. We say gather, that's the starting place. So, man, every weekend, church's been doing this for 2,000 years. But it's not just coming and receiving, like that's very important, but it's kind of the Martha and Mary. Like, man, you need to serve and you need to gather. So you need to come and receive and hear the preaching. We all need that. But you also need to serve. Part of maturity is saying, man, I'm not just going to come and receive. I'm also going to serve so that others can do that. So gathering, that's the starting point. Groups is the second one. And that's just basically the idea. Man, Christians have been doing this for thousands of years. For you to go deeper in your discipleship, yes, you need preaching, you need teaching, but you need people to live that stuff out with,
accountability.
Yeah, you could see what the Bible says about being a good husband, but it's helpful to be around a believer that's older than you where you could, okay, I'm getting to experience this guy being a good husband to his wife or being a good dad or whatever. Gather, group, give. The third one is give. People need to be called to give, and it's also something, not only does it grow them, it helps to grow the church. And man, a lot of growing churches that have reached a ton of people have been really stalled out because they have not learned how to cast vision around giving, and they've not learned to focus on that. And so, man, it's hard. It's hard, to invest in the mission for next year if you don't have money to do that. And then the last one is go. So gather, groups, give, go. And this basically just means, man, you got to get people and help them and disciple them to be able to live on mission. Not only to just invite their friends to church, that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. To be able to share the gospel with people and also to go out and live on mission. So gather, groups, give, go. And then lastly, the reason it's a flywheel is because after that begins to happen, then you say, okay, how does that get reinvested in the starting point? Because there is kind of a starting point to it. And how do we not, like you said, just go and, man, we got some more money, we got some more people, let's go start another ministry over here. So I don't know if you want to touch on any of those that maybe we've not, in the past, we struggled to focus on or we didn't equally focus on.
Well, I think when you think about going, I mean, that really is the kind of the final turn, because when people are willing to live with their eyes up, whether you're talking about local church growth, which comes primarily through invitations, or you're talking about starting other churches, and creating more of a network, which is like, we just sent out our 6th church plant, and we're counting on kingdom growth when that investment. We're going to invest 30. We're hoping to see 300 in a few years, and so that's all going to come from the going, kind of fueling back into the gathering part of our movement, whether it be in our church or in other churches that we plant. But that, that's the proprietary part of it is just trying to make sure that whatever that last turn is feeds into the first turn so that you have a little less energy that you got to expend on the second go around of the flywheel. I will say this too, not every church is going to think about gathering like we do. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that part of where we're at culturally, I actually think Breaking Barriers is helping people kind of come back around to this some stuff. But for a long time, if you said, hey man, our flywheel starts at the gathering, people will be like, oh, okay, here we go. We want to do something different. We want to start the flywheel with a missional community. The flywheel needs to start with one-on-one evangelism. And, that's fine. I think it's probably going to be a lot less effective, just statistically speaking. But whatever. It's like but however you're going to do it, you got to think about, man, how do the 3 or 4 or 5 elements? Where is the starting place, and how does it kick all the way back around?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So a good example for us, I think one where, man, we've put more emphasis on this in the last probably 2 or 3 years. So in gathering, when we're thinking about serving, getting people to serve, I think for a long time for us, it was a little bit like just kind of a necessary evil, like we know that we need people to serve. Like that's the only way to make the whole thing happen. But I think we've become way more convinced over the last 2 to 3 years that, like, man, you cannot take your foot off the gas in terms of getting people to serve, because in many ways, it's cool if somebody comes in and they do all the things. Like, that's awesome. You would hope for that. But most of the time, serving is kind of the starting place, and they're not just holding the door. They're not just, man, when people get really engaged around serving, like God begins to do something in their heart, and they're just so much more likely to do everything else. And I said this in our podcast last week, like, as I have messed around with just so much different data, putting different data in AI or whatever, and just being like, man, how do these different things relate to one another? Like, how does attendance relate to giving, and how does groups relate to this, and how does mission relate to attendance? The thing that I promise you every single time comes to the top as a correlation is, man, when more people serve, like, everything seems to just go better. And so that's a good example of, like, man, you totally could be trying to do all this without the emphasis on serving, and I think you'd be losing momentum.
Well, we view it as stronger than a correlation. I mean, we view them as causal when it comes to serving. We would say that serving is the domino that, like, creates a lot of other things that we want to see. And again, you're right. It's not for, I mean, my 2 older kids serve like every weekend, and I promise you it ain't because the church needs them to. I mean, as a dad, I'm like, I want them to. Right. This is so good for them. Relationships they get into, learning to live for a mission that's more than just the me monster of our day. I mean, all that is just so good for them. It's a great starting place.
Yeah, so you need to identify the right things. And I know that is so simple, guys, but I would just encourage you to, like, man, get with your team, leadership team, lead pastor, and really put some thought and prayer to this about, like, man, how do we see momentum? Like, how has God uniquely blessed our church? Like, man, God does bless different churches in different ways. Some churches are really great with this, or some churches are really great with this. And so it's like, man, it's doing the deep work of, like, thinking about, man, there's the mission that we're all on, but there's a unique sort of vibe and culture that your church has. And so identifying those things. Number 2, you got to stay disciplined to keep pushing those few things forward. And man, it's so easy. And you see sometimes larger churches that have been around a long time, you can kind of see this sometimes. Like, you go and visit that church and you realize, like, man, they literally have 30 or 40 things that they're doing. And those things were kind of spawned out of, man, at some point the church had momentum, it had money, it had people, and they're like, let's start this, let's start this, let's start this. And it's not that's never, like, that's okay. But sometimes, going back to that rowing analogy, it's like, man, you got both hands on the thing that you're pulling. If you're rowing and then you pull one hand off and try to do it with one hand, man, it's so much harder to do it.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening when the flywheel is going around and you're starting to get momentum. When you pull one hand off and say, man, let's take some of the resources to do this, let's take some of the energy to do this, it's hard.
It's like, man, you have a flywheel that's running the organization, right, of 3 or 4 or 5 things. Okay. And then the way I think about it is, like, for Breaking Barriers, for example, if you want to start a new thing, it has to have its own flywheel, right? Like, it has to have a way that it produces momentum for itself. And I think where churches get in trouble is, man, they've got the flywheel, 3 or 4 things that runs the whole church. But when they get to that last turn, instead of, like, reinvesting the energy, they start something new. But that thing is just a constant leech off of the energy of the actual flywheel.
A campus that's not successful, or some other.
or a ministry that just purely runs off of, like, nothing but money and people that it is sucking from the actual church's flywheel. It's like any ministry that begins, that's fine. Like, I mean, dude, I'm all into Simple Church and all that, but it's like, we started Breaking Barriers. We're going to start other ministries. You may want to start an age-based ministry or something, but that thing, or a new mission endeavor. Let's say a church decides, man, we're really into orphan care. We're going to start an orphanage in Guatemala or whatever. It's like, okay, but that thing can't just be the constant fruit. What's fueling it is just off of your church. You would think it would need its own way of running and sustaining and building and growing, and that means It needs a flywheel also.
Yeah, for us, like, Breaking Barriers is a good example. Like, yes, it needs a flywheel, but we are also very convinced that if Breaking Barriers is successful, it's going to help with our overall flywheel. And I think that is one of the questions you have to ask. And I remember going through this exercise after COVID where we were trying to figure out, okay, man, if resources are down, if people are down, if people serving are down, let's go through all of our ministries. And I remember having all of our ministries basically identify themselves. Okay, why does your ministry exist? as part of this bigger thing? Like, how does your ministry push this thing forward? Because, if you identify something and you're like, man, it just kind of doesn't. Like, it's just over here. It just doesn't add to the thing as a whole. And it's like, okay, that, may be a reason to simplify. Yeah, we're always starting stuff, but we're always asking, man, how is this going to impact? And when you do start something, you do need to recognize, yes, you are kind of slowing down momentum. Like, you only have so many resources, So if you take money and you're like, hey, let's start this thing over here, well, that's money that wasn't able to go to something else. Nothing wrong with it, but you at least need to think through that. Sometimes, like lead pastors that are like super visionary, they can probably struggle with this a lot, because it's like, man, as soon as something's running and going, man, they just start getting the vision for let's do this thing. And so this is really just about discipline, focus, discipline, keep focused on the right things. The third one is you got to reinvest the energy back into the beginning of the flywheel. And it's similar to the second one in that, like, you got to stay focused, but it's also different because this is really like, man, how the thing continues to go around by, okay, man, we have more people, whatever your flywheel is, we have more people, we have more money. How does that get reinvested back into? So why don't you talk about that just for us for a while, maybe even over the last 2 or 3 years? Like, okay, gathering is the start of our flywheel. What are some things we've done just to reinvest that energy back into that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the reason why we wanted to do a home and hub campus. I think that we really feel like, well, this is where it starts, and so we want to make sure that we have we're putting our best foot forward when it comes to that. I think that churches, when you really think about it, like, yeah, I think sending capacity is more important than seating capacity. Like, we love that, but we understand that for sending capacity, you need seating capacity. And so if you look at our budget, our budget is going to be very reflective of staff positions and facilities costs that have a ton to do with the weekend. I've heard a lot of guys kind of bemoan church buildings, and they only operate for 1-2 hours a week, at full capacity, and the rest of the time they're just sitting there. And I'm always like, well, no, they're doing their job,
right? Like
that. What do you mean they're just sitting there? Like, they did their job. Their job was to help facilitate an opportunity for gathering and serving, and the building did that. So you could do more with it or you could not, but it totally fulfilled its purpose for why we have it. So and I think continually trying to invest in our worship ministries and our age-based ministries that are part of that gathering, kids, just really saying that is, because it's where it begins, there is going to be a lion's share of things that go there, and not feel icky about that. I've seen guys with a massive guilt gene that are like, they need more of their dollars to be going to missions than it is going to, the gathering. And I'm kind of like, well, at some point you're kind of getting the cart before the horse. If we want to ultimately have more dollars and people go to the field, the biggest thing we can invest in is where the flywheel starts, which is the gathering.
Yeah. And people struggle with that for whatever reason. They just struggle with that. And the concept is like, man, whatever is working in terms of that momentum, those 3 to 5 things you've identified, like, you just got to keep doubling down. And it's not just money. It could be, okay, man, we got more staff now. Okay, how do our staff invest in those things? We do have more money now. We have more facilities now. We have more whatever, and it's taking that energy and saying, because it's not just for us, man, where going goes back into gathering. It's like, yeah, that is part of it, but it's really reinvesting in the whole thing. Because I remember maybe 3 years ago, we were around some other churches and we realized we were budgeting nothing for discipling people around generosity, or almost next to nothing. And that's a really good example where it's like, man, we want all of our money to go here. We want all of our money to go here. And it's like, it was good to take some of that energy and say, no, like, discipling people and giving is important enough to take some of your budget to take money and reinvest back in, man, how to create better environments to talk to people about the vision of the church, to talk to people about discipleship and generosity. Because people just, man, there's this, like you said, this prevailing, like, man, and people look at nonprofits, they're like, man, how much goes to operating versus how much goes to the mission?
Right.
And it's like, well, no nonprofit can do the mission without some sort of operating.
Right.
So it's just kind of identifying those things.
Yeah, I mean, there's 100 things you can pour energy into, you know? I think part of leadership is just trying to figure out what's the 1, 2, 3, 4 things that make it really go. We say this a lot on this podcast, but it goes back to me. A lot of it goes back to the Peter Drucker. It's not about doing the thing right. It's about doing the right thing. Mm-hmm. You know, we want to do excellence, and we want to do, man, it's got to be this way, and it's got to be perfect, and it's just totally fine if you want to be that way. But if you're missing the right things, it doesn't really matter how good you execute on the things that aren't going to move the needle that much, you know. And so for us, Gather Groups Give Go is a great way to anchor our entire staff, our elder team, me and you, to say, guys, if you walk out and you hand me a can of fuel right now, I'm only going to pour it in about 4 areas. If we got 4 little fires going here, I'm gonna figure out which one needs it the most, and I'm gonna pour the fuel on that. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm not gonna go try to start a new thing to maybe, start a new fire. I'm like, dude, those are the 4 buckets, so I'm gonna do that. And yeah, I mean, I think from a testimony standpoint as well, I just feel like I know a lot of churches that we've been around the game now for a long time, and better part of 20 years, and I just feel like I've seen a lot of churches that, because they just stayed faithful to like the few things that they do really well, it might have taken them 10 or 15 years, but they became an overnight success, you know? Right. And they kind of broke through, and that's the whole Jim Collins idea. One day that flywheel just kind of starts like spinning out of control almost, you know? It gets so much momentum, and that's what we want to see.
Mm-hmm. That's great, man. All right, man, that's great for today. Maybe we could do some other things in the future, because it's not just, it doesn't just help us, man. It helps you communicate, to the people that want to plug into your church, because you're casting a clear vision for where we're going. We've even organized our staff around this. I mean, we're really committed to like, man, okay, these are the things. Let's go all in on this stuff. So, hey guys, thanks for listening. If you're not part of our Facebook group, I would encourage you to maybe go check that out. We always talking about stuff like this. Churches are sharing stuff with one another. So I think it'll probably help you a ton. Thanks, guys.